Hello, everyone. My name is Eric Rosenbach. I'm the co-director of the Belfer Center, and we have a great day and lineup for you all here today to highlight the importance of supply chain security and emerging technologies. Did you all know it is Supply Chain Security Month? Right? Okay, yeah. I know when you woke up on the 1st of April, you thought, heck yeah, we're that special kind of cyber dork at the Kennedy School. It's Supply Chain Security Month. We joke about it a little bit, but it is very important. And today, through a series of different events, starting with this panel, we're going to learn more about that. And I would just like to briefly, very briefly, because you're going to learn a lot more about it, remind you when you're talking about supply chain security, for students who may not be so deep into this yet, there are two specific ways that you want to think. One is in hardware, and the quote here, the sticky bumper sticker is it baked in? You could think of ways in the supply chain that someone who is working on chips, for example, may find a way to put some type of purpose-built vulnerability in there. The Department of Defense has done many investigations into the supply chain to see whether or not there are hardware vulnerabilities in the chips that go into advanced technologies. And in fact, the Senate did a very high-profile one several years ago. Or you can think about software supply chain vulnerabilities, SolarWinds being the most high-profile, in which advanced nation-state actor gets into the actual software itself, inserts in the code things only they know about, then uses that as the edge of access to move laterally and do a bunch of other nefarious things. So that's the very high level of what we talk about, and you're going to learn a lot more from the distinguished panel. So we know it's Supply Chain Security Month. The next thing that is really interesting to hear about today is there's a brand new national cybersecurity strategy. And some of the people who worked very hard on it and authored it and have made really significant contribution to the United States are here today to talk to you about that and how they'll implement it. I can say this, I have worked on several cyber strategies. Most often, they on the very surface appear to what you may hear about this one. Guess what? It has 5 pillars. Every strategy in government has 5 pillars. Here's what's different about the one that all of these guests have written and worked on. It's actually really good. There's actual substance in it. And if you like look past the surface level of a pillar, you'll find that one of the most important aspects of that is supply chain. And they'll talk about how the strategy will be used to address the issue, the problem, and what the people here are going to try to do about it. When it comes down to it, then, it's the people who always matter the most, even in an issue like cyber, perhaps even more in an issue like cyber, because it's so techy and wonky. It's pretty easy sometimes to forget that people are the ones who do stuff. And we have an amazing panel of people here, leaders. David Sanger probably needs no introduction. He, as you know, teaches a class here. He's a senior fellow at the Belfer Center. He has a part-time job at the New York Times, including over the last couple days working on a big leak story, which has had pretty seismic impact on the national security community. David, thank you so much. David also is a true expert in cyber and tormented me often when I was in the Pentagon with a call like this. Hey, Eric, David, I hear that you may have a covert action program against the North Korean missile program. It's like, David, not talking to you, but we're still friends, and I have valued a lot of his mentorship. Val Cofield is now the Chief Strategy Officer at CISA. And if you look at her background, you see she worked not only in CISA for a very important job, but 22 years in the FBI. This is doing like real cyber work in a very hard environment, doing domestic cybersecurity, especially in some of the operational things that I'm positive she must have worked on, is tough work. We would try to collaborate with FBI from DoD, and their job is always a lot harder given the complexity of the Fourth Amendment, trying to work in and around things like FISA, privacy, and still trying to take down bad guys. So Val, thank you so much for being up here. Really appreciate that. Camille Stewart, if you look at her background, she's now also in a super important job. It's very nice to see you again. Thank you for being here. Has great background, not just in government, but in the private sector and in cyber. That's a really important aspect because sometimes in government, you see people who are working in cyber, but don't know the technology or how the private sector works. And Camille has an amazing background for that and has worked a lot on the strategy and developing people and human capital. They're in NCD. NCD is the new National Cyber Directorate. This is a new thing. It was mandated by Congress. Normally, the first hint it's going to be a bad idea is when it's mandated by Congress. In this case, though, I think they're doing a great job. The strategy, probably one of the most significant things to come out. And you can ask Camille a lot more about that. So Camille, thank you for being here. Dr. Edlyn Levine has the freedom to not be in government. She got her PhD in physics here at Harvard. If you look at her background, she's done a lot of research in this space in physics, and right now is one of the co-founders and senior execs for an organization that is investing in national security, technology-relevant companies in a way that's trying to bring more innovation to the field. And with that deep technical expertise, she has some pretty good ideas about how we get at this problem. So you see, we have an amazing lineup, but this would not have happened without some really good thinking from Lauren Zaborek, who's here, one of my favorite people in the world. Lauren now is a senior advisor at CISA. She used to be the director of the cyber project at the Kennedy School. She suffered in my class. She's an all-around badass, vet, Gold Star sister, someone I really respect. It's so nice to see you back here. She won a big award in DC. We're going to get that out on the Belfer channel. So congratulations on that, Lauren. So nice to see you again. And Jenny Lee, Jenny, stand up. Jenny, over the last several weeks, she really worked hard to put all this together. She, along with Emily, stand up, working not only all of the logistics, but also making sure we had an effective sequence of panel, director's lunch, all of those things so that y'all can learn. It's for the benefits of you, the students here. Okay, that was way too much from Rosenbach, the MC. So with that, thank you all for making time on a Friday morning for supply chain topics, especially when it's nice outside. Good job, way to go. You're gonna learn. And with that, I turn it over to Dr. Sanger.
Again. Okay. So thank you to Eric. It's amazing our friendship survived that North Korea story, Eric. Just for the record, they did have a covert action program and he did not discuss it. And we have written about it at great length, okay? But, you know, for all of those here with like legal background, they can get off his back. He wasn't a source. Okay. But it wasn't the first time or the last. I'm delighted to be up here doing this, and particularly with this panel of folks who have really worked so hard on this and who I think really represent the best of the way the U.S. is thinking now in far more sophisticated ways than they did even 4 or 5 years ago when I was working on The Perfect Weapon, the book about cyber. The degree of sort of subtlety, advanced planning, thinking ahead on cyber is so impressive in the U.S. government. What we're going to try to approach today is the question of whether or not this is also making progress, because the adversaries are also moving much more quickly in their sophistication along the way. Americans who don't think about the cyber security supply chain, which is probably 325 million of the 330 million Americans, just get little glimpses at various moments of elements of the problem, usually without being able to fully connect it together, which is probably my fault and the fault of my colleagues in as we try to explain something that is technologically quite complex, because it involves the integration not only of the hardware supply chain, but of the software supply chain, and we'll go into some discussion of that today. Little places where they've had glimpses in recent times. The US was buying large power transformers from China that were for use in our power grid. And when some of them arrived a few years ago, this was during the Trump administration, they were shipped off to a national laboratory, which found all kinds of interesting hardware and firmware elements built into them that would have given somebody in Beijing control over those elements of the grid that these power supplies were turned into. This led to actually an executive order in the Trump administration on the purchase of bulk power supplies, which I think is actually still in place. Is that right? Yeah, I'm getting nods here from people who know this much more than I do. There's not many things that the Biden administration admits to holding on to from the Trump administration, but that was one of them. And it was actually a quite well-written executive order. But it was also the wake-up call that you can get what seems like a big piece of hardware, in this case, a massive piece of hardware, that has built into it, buried deep in the system, some ability to allow remote control. That was, of course, part of our longstanding concern about putting Huawei equipment into the telecommunications network. It is behind the concerns about Hikvision, another Chinese maker. And though not all of the pages of these have made it out yet, deep in the leaks that came out over the past week of these classified Pentagon documents is a brief reference to continuing Pentagon concerns that Hikvision elements are sitting in parts of the DoD's supply chain. So, as you read through things, you'll see moments where things will pop up along that. Eric made reference to SolarWinds, which is sort of like the mother of all software supply chain events. And it's conceivable that the Russians did us a big favor here, because I think it really ramped up the awareness on this topic, because what happened was that the SVR, one of the more sophisticated of the Russian intelligence services, spent somewhere between 14 months and 2 years figuring out the update system within the software that SolarWinds, which makes network management software, performed before they pumped new versions out of their software, their Orion software, out to Fortune 500 companies and many different federal agencies, Treasury, Commerce, among them, but the list was long. And getting into the update was brilliant, because think about it. How many times do you, once every 2 weeks, plug in your phone overnight and Apple does an update, right? And every one of you, I know when you wake up in the morning, says, I'm not going to turn my phone on until I've read every line of code that Apple has put into my phone. Okay, Eric does this, but no one else in the room does, okay? And so the brilliance of getting into the update is that you are basically importing what could be flawed software into the phone. Now, we have deep trust in Apple, rightly or wrongly, but the whole system is based on the trust in that element, right? Just as the design of a chip is based on our trust in Taiwan Semiconductor. And Tom Friedman actually wrote a very long column you'll see in the Sunday paper, but it's up on the web already today. And that one of our issues here is we don't have trust in many other suppliers, particularly those coming from China, but not exclusively those coming from China. So what we're going to try to explore today with Edlyn and Val and Camille is this intersection of the trust in hardware design with the trust in software design. And you could argue that, that now that we're largely through the COVID-19 pandemic, we have learned about the need for trust in these supply chains. We had it in the medical side when we had interruptions in supply chain there. We have a greater sense, because of the incidents I've described, of the malicious state and non-state actors, the reliance on old technology here along the way, and the need to up this a lot. So let me start, Camille, with you. So we've all known about this cyber supply chain issue for a while, even if it hasn't been much broadly understood in the U.S. Tell us a little bit about what elements of it we need to be worried about most, whether it's the technology, whether it's state actors, whether it's criminal actors, whether it's the intersection of those.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. And you guys all should be excited about supply chain integrity month. Or maybe
I have to confess, Camille, until this morning, I did not know it was supply chain. Okay.
Don't worry, ONCD will fix that.
Okay.
Top of the list. So we think holistically about the digital supply chain. We think about the hardware, the software, the people. And when I say the people, I don't just mean the human capital. I mean the state actors. I mean hacktivists. I mean all of the actors that make up the ecosystem. And so when you think about the digital supply chain, when you think about the products that you use every day, think about all that went into it. Think about the component parts. Think about the rare earth minerals that help make the chip that went inside of it. Think about the software that powers it. And the software, think about those in two buckets. The proprietary software that Apple made and is theirs, but also think about the open source software that is the brainchild of a bunch of really smart people who just wanted to make cool things and then shared it with the other folks who also develop code, right? And wanted to have folks be able to build upon that and be able to share that. And much of, quite frankly, the proprietary software is also built upon open source software. And so when we think about the supply chain, we're actually trying to get as upstream as possible in how we address the vulnerabilities. So how do we think about the software? How do we think about semiconductors? How do we make sure all of those things are secure and that the folks that we trust, because that trust piece is really big, to build those things for us, to create those things for us, are held to a standard that means that they are creating something that we can all rely in. And that is not something that we can do alone in the federal government. It takes a lot of partnership across the private sector. And when I say the private sector, I mean basically all non-federal actors, right? I'm talking nonprofits, I'm talking big industry, I'm talking small companies, I'm talking VCs, I'm talking philanthropy. I mean, really everyone. We started this conversation, and I'm teeing this up so we can make sure we talk about this, Edlyn, was that the VCs actually have a role in mandating these things from the companies that they fund, right? And what a great steward of the ecosystem for a VC to say, if we are going to fund your company, you need to meet a certain set of security standards. You need to be tracking this. This needs to be a priority, right? Not only is just a good steward of the ecosystem, but as a responsible member of the board, as someone who wants to make sure that their investment has longevity, right? There are a number of different factors in that. And so a lot of this work is collaborative and requires us all to make really big investments and really important shifts in how we think about the evolution of a product. And I'm sure Val will talk today a little bit about the release that CISA just had, but making sure that products are secure by design and secure by default is a really big part of that. It should be a part of the ideation and conception of a product that we think about security. So, and that means that the supply chain, every piece and part, you should have more transparency in where those things came from and be able to hold those folks accountable. That will make things like when Log4Shell happened and we didn't know where the code was that was causing everyone problem was in our ecosystems, we should be able to fix that and now have a better understanding of what code is in our ecosystem. So there's a lot of work to be done, and it spans quite a few things.
Great. Well, thank you. It was a terrific overview for it. So Val, that tees you up here. So you've just turned out within the past couple of days, I think, yesterday, this secure by design bit. I confess that because we've been busy with leaking federal government documents, I haven't had a chance to read the secure by design strategy, but I promise I will. And when you guys talk about this, you talk about it in a really fascinating way, which is thinking for a bit about how we move from no security in the auto industry to real security. So, we started off driving on dirt roads and then, began to pave the roads. And then people suddenly decided that hard right turns wasn't a great idea. So we began to do exit ramps. And then we turned to the cars themselves and moved to seat belts and to airbags. And of course, industry resisted every one of those choices. Ultimately, we mandated those. Right now, it strikes me that you're still in what you and I were discussing earlier is sort of the early Ralph Nader element of this, which is you understand what you need to go do to make this secure, but you actually don't have the laws and authorities yet to mandate it. So tell us how we get from here to there.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thanks so much for inviting me to speak today. I do want to give a plug, as everyone, Camille and David have mentioned, is that yesterday we released on our website. So if you go to CISA.gov, you can see Shifting the Balance of Cybersecurity Risk, Principles and Approaches for Secure by Design and Secure by Default. And, CISA is not a regulatory agency. We really value our partnerships with the private sector. And I think Camille highlighted it's so important when you think about cyber is the private sector is one of the key stakeholders, right? They own and operate all of our infrastructure. They create these products. And, as David mentioned, we don't have any, because we're not a regulatory agency, we don't have any sticks in this discussion. But we do have a lot of data, and we want to get more data, and we're really excited about the CIRCIA Act, the Critical Infrastructure Reporting Act that passed last year. And, hopefully when the rulemaking is done with that process, we'll get even more data. But really what we've seen is that in this evolution of how, we've gone from, I remember when I was younger, I did not, I'm dating myself here. When I went to college, I didn't have a cell phone. I did have a computer, but it was not the same types of computers and computing power that all of you guys have right now. And it's been really an evolution. But a lot of what's triggered this, the market forces that have really built this revolution have been about getting your product first to market, right? That has been like the driving force, and that still really is the driving force of getting a product to market. But I think we've seen sort of the consequences, though, of that market force, right? Where if we take the car analogy, for example, I don't think any of us, I'm kind of upset that my car has recently told me that I need to go in because I need some regular maintenance, let alone if every freaking month, or how often do you guys get updates on your phone? You had to go into your car dealership to get your car fixed because there was something wrong, because they didn't build it properly to recognize that flaw. And so we're really trying to shift the conversation. I know Director Easterly is really passionate about this idea where we've got to change these forces, and we want the VCs to be involved, where they build in security at the onset while they're architecting these products, to think about security should be of the utmost importance. We want our customers' data to be secure, and that's how we're going to design these products. And yeah, it might take a little bit longer to get to market, but it will be a much better product, and that actually will reduce the attack surface area and not make it so difficult. Right now, the barrier to entry to be a cyber criminal is pretty darn low. You can buy almost any product on the dark web, whether that's a kit to do a ransomware attack. It's not a tenable space that we're in right now. And so this is something that we're trying to do, is really shift this dialogue. And we think the car analogy is a good one, where as David mentioned before earlier, the car industry didn't have there weren't any of these regulations, and certainly the car industry was definitely against having any regulations. So we're excited, and I'm excited to continue to have this conversation here with these panelists, where we've got to really shift the burden and shift the calculus of how these products are designed, both on the software side of things as well as on the hardware side.
Well, Val, you weren't really dating yourself because you said that you had a computer to bring. I think I wrote my thesis here in 1981 and 82 on a Trash 80 Radio Shack computer that we later discovered was the first computer to enter under the arch of Lowell House and be stuck in a dorm room there. So that really dates me, okay? But a question for you. So you're the chief strategy officer.
Yep.
So the strategy has got to be looking toward what a mix of persuasion and compellence you get here. And you're seeing this already by your colleagues in the White House who are thinking about how do you compel critical infrastructure operators to have minimum cybersecurity standards. So, after Colonial Pipeline, suddenly they discovered that TSA regulates pipelines, and all the pipeline operators got basically mandated instructions about what they should go do. You're beginning to see experiments about doing that with hospitals because they receive federal funds. I could go on with the list. Tell me at what point and what is the strategy to move to requiring this safety by design as happened in the auto case?
I'll start out, but I'd love Camille to also sort of weigh in on this. I mean, again, as I mentioned, CISA itself is not a regulatory agency, but we are one aspect of CISA that I think doesn't get as much prominence. I mean, we are a cyber, and Jen likes to call us the nation's cyber defense agency, but we are also, her role as the director is also the national coordinator for critical infrastructure. And the way the US government has divided and how we look at critical infrastructure, we've divided it into 16 sectors. And of the 16 sectors, there are what was codified in the FY21 National Defense Authorization is this idea of these sector risk management agencies. So there is a federal government agency that's in charge of each one of these 16 critical infrastructure sectors. And CISA is actually the SRMA for 8 of these sectors. But on top of that, we have the role of being the national coordinator. And if you look at the diversity of these sectors and think about the cyber skill set across the diversity of these sectors. Like you look at something like water, where there's not a lot of people in that sector that have the skill sets. And CISA itself is having a hard enough time trying to attract and retain cybersecurity experts. It's really going to be hard for EPA to do that as well. And so what we're doing and what we're thinking about at CISA and with the interagency is, so then how do we promote and help these sectors that maybe, it will be great in maybe 10 to 20 years for them to have their own indigenous cybersecurity capabilities. But in the meantime, there's an emergent need now. So how do we help them now? And that's really where CISA is trying to step in and take on that role. And we're really working together with EPA. We're working together with education as a subsector. But sadly, if you've read the news a lot, they've been unfortunately, the victims of very many ransomware attacks across school districts across the nation. And again, the Department of Education does not have a cybersecurity center of excellence, though I've heard they're trying to create a new cyber lab. But even then, it makes sense because that's still going to take a long time to build that excellence. They need to, and the need is now. The risks are great right now. And so that's where we're really trying to work together with these sectors and to help them, because even if they do have some sort of regulatory authority that they could try to tweak to help in the cybersecurity realm, they're still not going to, you need some expertise on how you want that to be implemented. And then on the other end of, is that constant, what I'll say is that regulation is a part of the solution, but it's not the answer in total, right? It's not going to be this silver bullet. If we regulate everything, that means we're all going to be secure. I think that's the wrong message to convey. So again, I do think this administration is forcefully trying to use levers that exist, to increase the cybersecurity baseline of critical infrastructure. But I think at the same time, we still got to push these initiatives like Secure by Design, because it's not a cure-all, even if we are able to increase more regulation.
Well, Edlyn, you've been very patient here, and I think that Val has really sort of teed up your favorite topic because, as you point out, it would be very difficult to design regulations that would fit the huge variety of software that is out there. But as SolarWinds showed, there is a big software problem here, not only in the design issue, but in the SolarWinds case, the Russians went in and fiddled with another company as the SolarWinds code without SolarWinds even recognizing that someone was up inside their code, which is in itself somewhat remarkable. So take us a little bit into how we should think about the risks of corrupting the supply chain, what you begin to do about it. You've got some innovative things you've been working on.
Sure thing. Yeah. One question some of you might have asked when Eric made my introduction is, okay, a physicist and a venture capitalist, like, what are you doing on a cyber, supply chain panel? What are you here for? So I'll give you just a quick background story of how I got into this, which is actually, directly related to David's question. I worked, from a research perspective as a physicist in a field called quantum information, which is thinking about the future of what the cyber landscape looks like that we move from a classical paradigm of computing to a quantum paradigm of computing, that we take advantages of quantum mechanics, the fundamental physics, and we can actually implement secure algorithms for example, communication or computation, et cetera. And there are actually companies, looking at the VC side, there are companies trying to develop these types of technologies. When I was working as a research scientist in this area, we came across a company in Switzerland that actually was subject to what was called a quantum hacking attack. Right, so you think, okay, here's the future, right? And this is part of what I spend my job doing, thinking about the future, inventing the future, investing in the future. And so here was a emerging, supposedly secure technology that had been hacked. How was it hacked? Was it done through an algorithm from a sort of software perspective? No, it actually was the physical implementation. There was an artifact in the single photon detectors that this company was using that actually gave attackers the ability to pull out the secret keys, right, and then decrypt the information. Right now, it turns out the hackers in this case were white hat hackers. They were trying to help the ecosystem. Oftentimes these are academic communities, where the academics actually lean in and try to hack systems, and oftentimes they're able to. But that gets into a principle which should be pervasive when you think about the cyber stack, cyber supply chain, and what it means, is attackers are always going to choose the weakest link. That could be the human factor, right? You think about the stack. There's hardware, there's software, operating systems, and humans, right? Human factor engineering and cyber attacks. That means you are part of the cyber system. You click open that phishing email, you've just, exposed yourself to a cyber attack. The software, who's writing your software, who wrote the libraries, right? How many of you have actually written code yourself, right? Coded anything up, right? You import library. How many of you read? What does the library have, right? What are those functions? Who wrote them? How many of you have designed a chip? I think fewer than software, right? But it's similar principles, right? Where the software that's used, the principle behind, designing a chip, you import IP cores and you assemble them. Who wrote the IP cores? Where are you pulling that from? Right? And so you think about it, same principle, you lock the door of your house at night, a thief isn't going to try to go through the front door. They'll go through the window that you left open, right? So that's the question. You have to think holistically. And this is also then the point behind, the hypervigilance in this area. Cyber is never an issue that we're going to retire, right? Because it's always a question of innovation, measure, countermeasure, measure, countermeasure. And who is going to be developing those, on the attacker side, they can be economically motivated, they can be, state actor motivated to actually get into critical infrastructure. And then on the, consumer side, right, on the countermeasure side, you have to think, are you a government agency? Are you a company, right? And, Camille's exactly right. When we make investments as VCs in companies, we're making an investment in that future, right? In what is the economic outcome of this company that's scaling a new technology. And even if they're not a cyber company, right? Let's say that they're developing, next generation, medical diagnostics. If someone can get into their system, steal their IP, replicate their product, then they're going to be able to decrease, right, zero out the market value. Right? And we were talking about some companies here, right? They're example companies that I can talk to you about, after the panel if you're interested in. But basically, they lost all of their IP and then lost their company because of insider threats, because of cyber threats that basically left them without anything unique, right? Someone was able to replicate everything that they were doing. And so that's when you think holistically, to David's question, good attacks, it depends on the motivation. Sometimes the attack is meant to be completely covert, right? And a well-designed attack, which could be, for example, a hardware Trojan that's inserted into an integrated circuit. It could be a software update that then inserts malicious code into a system. If it's well-designed, you will not be able to detect it. And sometimes when it does present itself, it presents as a flaw, right? This is what we see in the hardware side as well, right? That oftentimes what is actually a Trojan will present as, okay, this was, potentially just something wrong, if it presents at all. But then there are also overt attacks, which are meant to, for example, wipe out your entire system, right? And so one of the, we talked about SolarWinds, but another recent, cyber event in the news was what you probably read about with the software on cranes that we have put into ports in the United States, right? There's concern because it comes from the software that's used to manage these cranes come from a Chinese company, and we're concerned about civil-military fusion. And this is where cyber supply chain actually directly marries with supply chain for everything, because U.S. ports bring in $5.4 trillion worth of commercial and military goods per year. So think about it, right? Here, your cyber supply chain directly could impact your regular supply chain for everything, because someone can, for example, if there's a kill switch in the software, wipe out the functionality of those cranes. Or, right, again, that's overt. Covert, they could actually just monitor everything that is coming into U.S. ports. It's a huge amount of intelligence. If you think about, for example, DoD acquisitions programs, you try to hide where it is you're getting things. I mean, I don't know if any of you have read Skunk Works about, Lockheed Martin's development of planes, right? They were importing titanium from Russia to develop the SR-76, which they then used to spy on Russia, okay? But if Russia had access to the port information for importing the titanium, potentially they could back out that type of program to develop that platform, that airplane was actually going on, right? And so think about the power of that knowledge, and therefore the power of the cyber supply chain and how it directly marries into our supply chains of everything.
Let me ask you one quick question, and then we'll run this fairly quickly, because in about 8 minutes, I want to open this up to questions from everybody. So if you think about the supply chain, your great titanium SR-76 example here, during the Trump administration, while there was discussion of this, the overall solution was keep the international supply chain pretty open. In the Biden administration, we've begun talking a lot about what it is we bring back home. Rare earth metals, certainly semiconductor production. I don't think 3 weeks goes by as a White House correspondent when one of us isn't trotting off with the president to break ground in some semiconductor plant, including one a week ago in North Carolina that I had never heard of before, and I've covered this for 40 years. So he's going down deep. Okay, so which approach makes sense? I mean, obviously, we can't make everything here, and we're not going to be able to. And obviously, we're not going to be able to do all the software here. But how do you decide what is so valuable that you can only do it here? For any of you. Val, you want to start on that since you were?
Yeah, I mean, I think you all know that the Biden administration passed the CHIPS Act, and clearly, there is a national risk in having all of the chip making or sophisticated chip making concentrated in one area of the world, that they've recognized that needs to shift. But I agree with David's point that there's no way we can bring everything. We're not going to onshore everything. That's just it's not feasible. But I think we need to be thoughtful. And I think the crane example is actually a really good example of this, and why we've got to do this. And we're trying to do these analyses of the cascading impacts of certain components within a function. So
by the way, Val, I hate to interrupt you, but in the crane example, just to bring everybody up to date, did we ever find any evidence that it was being exploited, or simply that it was a vulnerability?
No, I'm not aware of anything that's been.
I'm not either.
Yeah.
So you could probably find that if you went to a port, it wouldn't just be cranes. You'd find that in basically everything.
Yes, but with the cranes, then the particular cranes that that were being referenced are the market share that they have of building those specific type of cranes is huge. I think it's like 75% or 80% of market share. And that's where you start to think there's a risk because there's no way to substitute. There's no easy way to substitute, and there's no easy way to all of a sudden have the ability to be a manufacturer of those specific type of cranes that are so important to the global supply chain, the world's economic supply chain.
Same thing with power generators. We don't make a whole lot of those either.
Yeah. And so I feel like that's where I think we are, at least as a government, administration, starting to take a look at those things. Though, where are the real concentrations where there's no substitutability or very difficult to substitute, and then doing that risk analysis and figuring out in those instances maybe we do need to consider onshoring some of these.
One difficulty though, and this is directly related to the point, is why does China have such a huge market share on those cranes? It's because they have state subsidization, right? That locks in that market share. If you look at how, for example, China captured the panel for photovoltaics production, it was because of heavy subsidies that basically undercut the market. And we see this actually multiple times. And actually, my fund does a lot of work in monitoring the Chinese parallels for the types of technology emergence, and it is striking. So contrary to what both of you were saying, which is the U.S. can't do it all, especially for semiconductors, China says we can do it all and we will. They are literally replicating the entire semiconductor supply chain, from design to manufacture to materials to the actual machines that make them, to the assembly and test, to the integration on printed circuit boards, et cetera. The entire supply chain they are replicating, and their goal is to own it. They own it for themselves in their domestic market, and then ultimately they will own it for the rest of the world because of this type of price undercutting. So to give you examples, just looking at the global landscape for semiconductor startups that have received funding, there's a startup in China that last November closed a $500 million round to do what? To create electronic-grade silicon wafers. And you say, what VC in their right mind would invest in a company that is creating silicon wafers when this is available on the market by technology giants, mostly in Japan, right? So the free market's response is, we will source wafers from Japan because it's available. A VC would never invest in this because unless you're better, faster, cheaper, or Brave New World, there's no market. But in China, the VCs are investing in this because they're trying to replicate the entire supply chain. And there is a market inside China for Chinese-made, Chinese-sourced companies. And it's the same thing across, I was talking with Eric earlier about electronic design automation. The United States for semiconductors, this is where software meets hardware. We lead the global market for the software to make semiconductor devices. And so there's no reason a VC would look, unless there's something really radical, that a US VC would invest in an EDA startup, an electronic design automation startup. In China, there are multiple tens of EDA startups that have raised close to $500 million. And it's again the same reason. And these companies are going to compete directly. They will have a closed market. This is something Senator Warner talks about a lot when it comes to semiconductors, 5G, where champions grow up in the market within China, and then they get opened up to the rest of the world, and often non-market forces are used to promote them and artificially subsidize. And that's one of these key issues that we, as a country that ascribes to free markets, in order to keep our cyber supply chains robust, and in order to keep our supply chains across other things like minerals and so forth robust, we have to have an answer to the non-market forces that are being used by China in particular, but other countries. China is unique because it is so huge. And that's then the point of what do we onshore, what do we not? We have to answer.
So Camille, since you are representing the ONCD, which sits right in the White House complex, we'll make you personally responsible for both explaining and defending the Biden administration policy here. So Edlyn's right. The Chinese subsidize this stuff. The CHIPS Act is, although no one wants to describe it this way, a subsidization industrial policy program. Two words that you don't want to use in Congress because you end up losing votes every time you throw these out. So the two critiques of it, which run contrary to each other, is One, we're doing exactly what it is we're criticizing the Chinese for doing. And second, we're not doing it big enough. So there's $52 billion for chips in it. I was just at Taiwan Semiconductor a few weeks ago. Every fab these days costs about $15 billion. Now, obviously, there's going to be a lot of commercial money going in with the, right? Which is, by the way, about the cost of the last aircraft carrier we built, the Gerald R. Ford. Okay, so think of each one of these as an aircraft carrier, right? You get 3 carriers out of your 52 billion with a little left over. Tell us how to think about what you do post CHIPS Act to deal with the scope of the problem here.
I mean, in tandem with the CHIPS Act, we are also working with our allies so that we are not carrying this burden alone. Back to the trust conversation earlier, we don't feel like we are the only makers that have to be a part of this ecosystem, right? We have a number of trusted partners and allies who can also be a part of the semiconductor supply chain and who we trust to build out these component parts. And so we are collaborating with our international partners. And you'll see that throughout the National Cybersecurity Strategy. There's even a section that's focused on the global supply chain and how we work with our allies and partners. We are thinking about federal acquisition. How do we make sure that the money that we are spending, the money that we allocate, continues to fund that investment in that upstream component part, whatever that is, whether it's the semiconductors on the hardware side or how we invest in open source software or in software in general. And then we're also thinking about how we harmonize some of the supply chain related authorities we have across the government to counteract the movements that China and other nation states are making. And so we're thinking about our way of countering this movement holistically. And so the priorities span those 3 different areas. And I mean, the CHIPS Act won't be the end. I anticipate that there will be more money allocated after this 5-year period. But we want to see how this evolves, how this investment works in the US, how our allies counter and complement that. And then we'll see what the next set of investments look like.
Great. Well, we only have about 14 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we leave a little time for questions here. So we've got a microphone that will go around. Who's the first victim?
Hi, I'm Pearl. I'm a master's student here. Thanks so much for the super interesting panel. Also great to see lots of brilliant women on a panel. I have 2 questions for anyone who's interested in answering. One is about the placement of liabilities in the supply chain and the idea of the reverse cascade or placing liabilities pretty low, like with distributors. I'm wondering if you've seen evidence that that works and that's a possible way to move, risk mitigation further upstream. My second question is about the technical political gap and how to work with policymakers or regulators that maybe don't have the technical background and what steps are being taken. At the policy development side, also like the professional development side, what advice do you have for someone who is very interested but maybe doesn't yet have the deep technical knowledge?
Wants to take that on first?
Start with the last one. One, to work in this space, you have to be a lifelong learner. And so don't think that there's anyone who knows everything about everything in cyber, right? People are getting smart on the issues, are taking courses, are making sure that they can understand the technology inherent in the work that they are doing. I mean, there will be people who are deeply technical, but they need your expertise, whatever that might be, whether it's a legal background, communications, all of those things. And if you are willing to do the work to bridge the gap between your technical know-how and the skill set that you do have, you will be a very valuable asset in the work. This is definitely a multidisciplinary problem. And so looking at this from a variety of lenses is really important. The bridging the gap between the policy know-how and the technical know-how in general. there are a number of programs, like on the Hill, they have Tech Congress, where they bring technical folks in to support members of Congress, help them really think through legislation that they're trying to build that has a technology focus. I mean, offices like ours are really built to be a coming together of a variety of backgrounds. Like, for example, my division within ONCD is focused on future resilience of people and technology. I've been very intentional about bringing folks with private sector backgrounds, with federal backgrounds, with very technical backgrounds. One of my deputies is a cryptographer, so that we can all come together with our variety of expertise, that multidisciplinary approach that I talked about, and help inform the interagency. And you'll see that across the federal landscape. More and more, we are pulling folks with a variety of backgrounds such that we can really think holistically about the challenge space. So it's not just a technical problem. It is the people, the technology, the roles and responsibilities, and doctrine and policy. So how do we all come together around that challenging landscape? So you'll see more and more of that. And I forgot your first one.
Liabilities.
So much work. So you'll see in the National Cybersecurity Strategy, software liability, the liability landscape, and where you place that is a big part of the implementation work to come. We are seeing models like out of EU where folks want to bring that to the developers and to individuals and things like that. I mean, there are a number of different models being tested. I think there'll be more to be seen, but we recognize that that liability schema is going to need some safe harbors as we start out. Folks are going to have to get some passes as we transition, and folks better understand what their supply chain looks like. But pinpointing where that is will look different depending on whether it's software and hardware, whether they've created the entire landscape of the pieces and parts within that product. I mean, it's going to be a tough challenge. So if you've got ideas, please come work with us.
I just wanted to say on Camille's point, when we started the Harvard Cyber Initiative here, which Lauren later ran so brilliantly, it was precisely because you had engineers who weren't talking to the policymakers, and they didn't even have a central gathering place in academia, much less what Camille just described in government. And at that time, ONCD hadn't even been conceived of. It came out of the Cyber Solarium report. So we made a lot of progress with that, but getting engineers to be policy conversant is almost as hard as getting policymakers to sort of sit for the technology. So, anyway, other questions that are out here, right here.
So for issues like cybersecurity, trust sounds like a centerpiece to building ally, finding ally, identifying people you can work with or not. It also sounds like, take China for an example, we reluctantly in the United States work with China on softwares on the cranes, for example. So I wonder what kind of conversation is going with allies and with potential opponents. And then is there any treaties or anything going on that could take us to a future where we could worry about it a little less or a little more?
If you would hand the microphone right behind you there, we'll take two questions at one time so that the panel can do that great Washington thing of figuring out which one they don't want to answer. Yeah.
Thank you so much for speaking with us today. I have a question regarding the role of VCs in holding maybe technologies they invest in accountable for to a certain standard of supply chain resiliency or security. Do enough incentives exist for VCs to have that standard? And if so, how can those incentives be created or even modeled, maybe by America's Frontier Fund or anything else in the...
So the second question's for Edlyn. Who wants to take the first one?
I'll take the first one. So, I mean, if you notice on this report, it's multi-sealed actually with many, many other countries. And so I do think that we are in these, cyber is one of these unique issues where it is international, right? There's, and especially when you look at any sort of cyber incident, in my time at the FBI and now, I don't think there's ever been a cyber incident that hold from the beginning to the end of it is contained within the borders of the U.S. There's always going to be an international dimension to it, and so I think we are working with our close, our Five Eyes partners are our closest partners, but we are broadening that coalition. And even when it comes to China, I mean, I was just in a group discussion with our leadership talking about vulnerabilities within Chinese-made products. And, in CISA, we house our CERT team. So, and there are international CERT teams around the world. And there are times where we have people disclosing to us vulnerabilities on different products. And we actually do have, from our standpoint, we've reached out to Chinese companies who, vulnerabilities been disclosed to us, and they do act on it, and they do work on it. So I feel like there are layers of the dimensions with our relationship with China, but certainly from that perspective, like we do have open lines of communication, and we do work with them together on.
Valerie, tell us why they work with us on it. So when there's a vulnerability disclosure to you, I assume it's confidential, right? Last thing they want to do is read it and say the New York Times, just to pick an example out of no place. Do they work on it because they're genuinely concerned that the vulnerability exists, or they're genuinely concerned that you will make it public and thus kill the market for them?
I mean, I don't know the motivations, but I would hope that it's because, I think China does want to, motivations of China are very different from motivations of Russia, where China does want to be a world leader in many of the products that they produce. And so I think that, I would think that they care about their reputation, and they care about the reputation of their products.
Great. Val, just quickly so that we can, I'm sorry, Edlyn, quickly so that we can
Sure.
get on to the next question, if you can take on the VC question.
I'm going to start with a question to all of you. How many of you have either started a startup or been part of one? Okay. So you know that a startup is focused 100% on how do we get to that MVP, product market fit, customer discovery. There's a lot. You're a lean, mean, super efficient team. And do you have time to focus on cyber? And the other question, this is actually one of my appeals to both of you, right, is better connectivity and support between the US government and the startup community. If you're a startup that's developing a critical technology and you have the state of China, right, the entire government of China targeting your startup and your technology, good luck. You're not going to be able to protect. And so no matter what the VC does, right, and I will tell you, the incentive, good VCs will always ask their startup companies, what is their cyber posture, right? Do they have security around the IP that they're developing? Because if your IP gets compromised and your technology gets compromised, exactly, the investment, right, the money that I put into your startup, suddenly that investment zeroes out. The valuation of your company is nothing because you have someone else, right? It could be a big company, it could be a small company, it could be government, right? They will take your technology and they will replicate and they will push you to the ground, right? So that's the key point, right? Any VC that's worth its weight will be insisting on that. And that's also a point to all of you. If you guys think about starting a startup, you should be very selective. I mean, you're Harvard. Come on, guys. Be selective about the VCs that you let invest in your company, right? A good VC will ask you, what is your size? A good VC will ask you, what's your treasury policy? So you avoid situations like SVB. Okay, good VCs will take a position on your board and care about your company and give you advice that's meaningful to successfully scaling a business, including cyber. And the market is the answer. The incentive is 100% there. What's missing is that ability for a small company to protect itself. A VC doesn't have the resources to provide, huge cyber tools. That's not our skill set, right? The company doesn't necessarily have that skill set, that knowledge, that awareness. They might not even be aware that they're a target.
So one of the things Jim came out. Right, which is
Right. Ender.
we
And that's the key point, right? Is any VC that's worth its weight is going to be paying very, very close attention to this.
Boy,
But
is that
it's an evolving.
that's a really great example.
Mhm.
Well, we have lots of questions left for you, but unfortunately, we do not have lots of time left. So I want to thank you all for what's been a really great panel. And if when we come back at 10:45, there's a break here now. I think there will be some office hours with ONCD and with CISA and Sunita Patel and Val here and other staffers will be talking to you. I want to thank you all for what's really been, I think, one of the deepest conversations I've sat through on supply chain. So I really want to tell you how much I appreciate you doing this, and thank you all for coming to this.